iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome back to iGlobeViews, our weekly podcast where we discuss world politics and current events. My name is Diana Martner-Markov. I'm editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org. And today, again, to discuss, as every week, is Professor Susanne Weigelin-Schwirtzig, our world-renowned China expert. And our topic for today is the next economic meltdown made in China? And for the record, this session was recorded on August 21st, 2026. If you enjoyed our discussion, please remember to follow, like, and subscribe. Suzanne, before we get into our discussion, I just wanted to mention for our audience that your latest book just hit the bookshelves, China and the New World Order. That's the English title. It's currently in German, but it will be translated into English, I'm sure. Congratulations for your new book, Suzanne. What motivated you to write this book?
Thank you very much for mentioning this. For someone like me, who is a professor at a university, it is always a very unusual thing to experience that people read your books, because for all these papers we write, they go through peer review and it takes ages and ages until they finally come out. And then you realize that after having done all this work, maybe something like 50 people read your paper, and you can be really proud if 50 people read your paper. But when you write for a somewhat larger audience, then suddenly you realize, oh, there seem to be people around in the German-speaking world who are interested in China, who are interested in understanding how China views the world and the future of our world. The first version of this book in 2023 was sold out within a comparatively short period of time, although they had printed 6,000 copies, which is a lot for an academy. And now they decided they wanted to have a second updated version. I changed the book quite a lot according to all the discussions I had between 2023 and 2026. And so I started my book by talking about the war in Iran. Something we had elaborate discussions about, but something which is not really in the media, at least in the German-speaking world. How do the Chinese assess the situation? What do they think? I started my book by introducing what I knew about China and its understanding of the war in Iran. Then the second chapter is about this very difficult situation between China, Russia, and the US. The third is about China and Europe. I replaced the original last chapter, which was also about China and Europe, by a chapter about China and the Global South, focusing on BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because I realized that in my discussions with the public here in Austria, people are very interested in understanding what is BRICS about, what is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, why does China have these relations to other countries, and how does it relate to Russia, because both of these organizations are jointly run by China and Russia.
Well, congratulations. It sounds like a very interesting read. I'm looking forward to reading it myself. And many of those topics are topics that also we discussed. So I'll be very interested in your book, Suzanne. Congratulations on it.
The series in which I published this book is a series that publishes books that you can read over the weekend. They're not really thick.
Oh, nice.
They're not really thick. So, and everybody tells me it's 200 pages. It's a comparatively small book. Wait a sec. I can show it to everybody. It's a comparatively small book. One of the things you have to watch out for, that you don't write like professors like to write really thick books, and they write and write and write and write and write and write. And the result is that nobody really has the time to read them. So they want us experts to write books that people can read over the weekend and that have topics that people seem to be interested in.
Excellent. Well, we'll put the link in our description. If you can get it on Amazon or somewhere, we'll put it down below. And I think that's a great idea. That's also the theory we have at iGlobeNews, that we don't want these academic papers when you write about a topic. It's supposed to be an in-depth analysis, but please not an academic discussion. Yeah. And I think those analyses are always very well liked. It just gets to the point.
Yeah.
Our topic for today is the next economic meltdown made in China? So we'll be discussing China's economic policies, how these are affecting the world, and vice versa. So 3 Ds affecting China's economy are debt, deflation, and demography. Xi's policies have been criticized for being too austere and doing too little and sometimes too late to stimulate China's sagging economic numbers. In the latest 5-year plan, the Chinese president cements the shift to an innovation-driven economy over a consumption-driven one. China operates on 5-year planning cycles that also overlap with its 5-year political cycles. The plans are painstakingly put together across multiple levels of government agencies over at least 2 years and reflect the top's leadership political mandate. The Chinese Communist Party adopted an anti-involution campaign in 2025 for its 15th 5-year plan for 2026 to 2030. The plan promotes consumption, particularly in rural areas. An anti-involution campaign means stopping destructive race to the bottom price wars and overcapacity in manufacturing, e-commerce, and tech sectors. The CCP has also taken modest steps to strengthen its social safety net with the goal of reducing the incentive for households to save instead of spending. So, can you tell us about Xi's economic vision for China? Can you actually run an economy the size of China on 5-year plans?
Well, China has been running its economy on 5 years plans since 1949, which is not totally true because it took them a few years before they had their first 5-year plan. But already when the nationalists were still ruling China, they also had a 5-year plan logic. And even if I am informed correctly, at the beginning in Taiwan, they also had 5-year or 6-year or 7-year plans. Also in Japan, we have something like plans that give strategic orientations to investors for the next 5, 6, 7 years to come. And this is also true for South Korea. This planning of the economy is not so unknown also to other countries in East Asia. At the beginning, in the People's Republic of China, these 5-year plans were then put into a year-by-year plans, and then they would even say you had to produce so and so many wheels for automobiles, and you had to grow so and so many potatoes. So it was a very detailed plan. And it's no longer that detailed in the People's Republic of China because, as we all know, they started realizing that this planned economy had no internal dynamics that would make this economy modernize itself on a regular basis. I first went to China in the 1970s. The economy was very, very traditional in the sense that it would always go on and on and on the same way it had gone on in previous times. There was a lack of innovation, a lack of dynamics. And because of that, they started changing their plan system, but they didn't give it up. And I think one of the reasons they didn't give it up is because they wanted for the state to play a very important role in the development of the economy, because if the state played a very important role in the economy, that would also support the CCP's claim for being the only party existent in the People's Republic of China and legitimated to rule the country. And I think this is a very interesting and very important intrinsic relationship between party, state, and economy. And I think this is something we have to have at the back of our mind when we assess what's going on in China at this particular moment. And I think very interestingly, one could come to the conclusion that when Xi Jinping took over power in 2012, he realized that the private economy sector of the Chinese economy was already so strong that no longer could the party tell the economy what to do, but the economy would tell the party what to do. And then he realized if things change into this direction, there is an intrinsic danger for the Communist Party of China to continue its rule over China. And this is the reason why we have this enormous disruptive change in policy that we started to observe immediately after Xi Jinping had taken over. So one of his most important objectives of his economic policies is no longer, as it was in the past before he came to power, to just develop the economy because China wanted to become rich, and China wanted to make it possible for the country to become rich, and at the same time for the China's middle class to become rich, and at the same time to have the peasants and the workers of the country also participate in gradually getting richer. Everybody in China should come to the conclusion at the end of each year that this year was better than the last one. Right? And very interestingly, this situation started changing already before Xi Jinping came to power, under the rulership of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, although these people were still very much in favor of having the economy develop with the help of the private sector. We already realized, starting from the year 2008, maybe, financial crisis, we started realizing that things were not going as smoothly as they did in the past in China. So when Xi Jinping took over, he defined a new goal, which is not develop the economy, but make sure that the party will still be the ruling party in the next decades to come. And for that reason, he started introducing a policy that was very much focused on reaching certain political aims rather than reaching certain economic aims. And this is one of the reasons why things have changed so much in China lately.
Very interesting. In our last podcast, you mentioned that China is running into enormous difficulties in the economic sector, and that one of the reasons why they are running into these enormous difficulties is because of Xi Jinping's policies. You said that China will have to change and readjust their economic policies, and if President Xi agrees to this, they, quote, they will let him remain in power. So, quick question. Who are the they that you were talking about, and what readjustments were you referring to?
Very difficult question, because we know, of course, that there is an entourage of about 6 people who take the most urgent and the most important decisions together with Xi Jinping. In the Standing Committee of the Politburo, we know that there are 24 people in the Politburo that are like the enlarged entourage for Xi Jinping. We know that there are hundreds of people in the Central Committee. We know their names. We don't always know whether or not they are very much in line with Xi Jinping. We don't really know this. But quite interestingly, we also know that there are always people who are not very happy with what is going on in China at this moment. The problem with the economy in China is that the original model they had, which was an export-oriented development model that many developing countries go through, this model says we have very, very low costs for our production. So that is why as soon as we can produce all kinds of things that the world needs, we can do this at very low costs. And for that reason, we have an easy export situation. And with all these exports, we also accumulate lots of foreign currency, especially US dollars. And with these US dollars, we can then buy, for example, machinery outside China that we cannot produce in our own country in order to raise the level of production to an even higher level of modernization. Right? And it was very clear at the beginning of the 2000s when China became a member of the World Trade Organization that this model was working quite okay, but that it also had some implicit problems. One of the implicit problems was, of course, that the more China started producing all these things, the more they needed raw materials from outside being imported into the country in order for the country to be able to produce all these things. And that had an enormous effect on the price for raw materials, because suddenly there was this enormously big country with a big market that also had a demand for many things that it couldn't have a demand before because the people simply didn't have the money to be able to buy these products. And they were all produced outside China, so there was no way for people to consume these products. And suddenly they started consuming, and China started producing. And then this meant that they had a lot of need for raw materials to be imported to China, and this had an effect on the price for these raw materials, and that was a problem by itself. So this started to be very clear starting from the year 2008, 2009, and we have lots of internal discussions in China at the time about these starting problems, which are very typical also to this middle income trap. So when China started raising the income of the people in China, then this brought this export-oriented model to a certain level, and it's very difficult to go beyond. And to a certain respect, we can say that up until today, China is somewhat caught in this middle income trap. This is one of the problems they have. I think that the people who are not so supportive to Xi Jinping's policies are people that think that because of his false assessment of the implications of the middle income trap, China's economy is now going down with regard to its GDP growth rates rather than going up. And we still think that 4% is wonderful. I think every expert knows that 4% is much more than the reality of GDP growth in China, and that maybe we should speak about something like 2% rather than 4%. But they officially, of course, tell us that it's 4%. And if you compare the 4% with 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you will see that China is now already in a situation where its yearly GDP growth rate is going down and down and down and down and down. And this is a problem for a country that doesn't have a social security system that somewhat helps people who lose their jobs. And there are many people in China who are losing their jobs at this moment.
Two questions. So when you say middle income trap, could you explain to our audience how you're defining this? And also, is it true that now in the last 5-year plan, they are trying to make these safety nets, these social safety nets, so that if people do lose their jobs, they won't be left completely on their own?
Yes, this is very true. They have waited a very long time before working on their social security system. The first thing for them to introduce to the population was the pension system, which did not exist in Maoist times and which had to be built up. They have now worked on the system, although it is still very, very feeble, very, very deficient, so that people go into pension at a comparatively early time in their life. So people already go into pension in their 50s, but they are allowed to continue to work for non-state entities. The private sector very often welcomes these very experienced people who some of them previously worked in the state sector, and they take them into the private sector. Or if you had already worked in the private sector before you went into pension, you could renew your contract with your private company, with your private employer, and the private employer would define the income you could generate differently from times when you were fully employed. And this is also a very interesting procedure that we might encounter in future with our pension system, and which is a procedure that you can observe in all East Asian countries. When people start having their pension and they're still able to work, then they get new contracts from their employers, and these contracts are not as costly as they used to be prior to going into pension, but they still give them some support to their income, so that the difference between the pension and the regular income they had before entering retirement is not as big as it usually is in East Asia. There is a big difference between what you get in retirement as compared to what you get before entering retirement. And so China started working on this issue. Then the next issue is healthcare. So health insurances were step by step introduced to the country, and even including the many, many peasants of China who started being integrated into a health insurance system by 2007. This was also very supportive to the whole medical sector in China becoming a very, very important economic sector for the economy as such. I think there is no sector in the Chinese economy that is as much organized by the market economy as the health sector. So people in the health sector who work in the health sector in China earn a lot of money. Hospitals earn a lot of money. It is incredible how the whole health sector is as capitalist as it can be. And for that reason, there was an interesting coincidence between building up the insurance sector so that people could afford to go and see the doctor, and at the same time building up the economic capacity of the healthcare sector and making this a very vibrant sector for the economy as such, including the development of pharmaceutical industries as well as the healthcare sector as such. And the last step is now being built up. This is the unemployment insurance, which they so far did not have or had at a very rudimentary level, which was very often organized company by company rather than, across a province or across a big city, which is usually the unit that is included into these different insurances. So we don't have one insurance for the whole of China. We usually have one insurance for one province or a bigger city. And this also creates problems because when people move from one province to the other, then they have the same problems we have when we move from one European country to another European country and work in both of them, and then finally have to receive pensions from multiple countries. Until you accumulate enough that you can help people that need your insurance, it's a comparatively long time. And you look back at, insurances being introduced to Europe already at the beginning of the 20th century, you see that the income of the insurances could rise step by step with the development of medical treatment, which get more and more costly. But China develops these insurances at a time when they already introduced very costly ways of treatment because they learned about these costly ways of treatment in the US and in Europe and in other countries. So there is a mismatch between the costs you generate and the income you generate, right? And this implies that people are still saving a lot of money because they feel that once they enter retirement, their standard of living before retirement was much higher than afterwards. They are very much afraid that if they get sick, they don't have enough money to guarantee that they can get the best treatment. And they also don't think that the money they get from their unemployment insurance is enough to sustain them, at least for a certain period of time. So this is one of the reasons why people in China are still very much into saving their money rather than consuming what Xi Jinping would like for them to do in order to get the internal demand up and not to export as much as China is exporting at this moment.
Well, thank you. I have a number of follow-up questions for your answer there. Could you just tell us once more this middle income trap that you were talking about? How would you define that?
Yeah. Well, the middle income trap is usually an income trap where the development of the economy has reached a level where this comparative advantage of very low production costs can no longer be upheld. So you have to raise the wages, but at the same time, it is difficult for you to develop a productivity that allows you to still export at very low prices although your wages have already risen quite a lot. And if you look at the situation in China, you see that wages have been rising enormously, approximately until the year 2018, 2019. And because they were not able to keep up productivity with the rising wages, they then started to counteract this tendency, and they're going down now rather than keeping the same level of wages that they had reached in 2018, 2019.
Interesting. I have now some questions regarding your answer on the health insurance. And I kept thinking in my mind, well, these are many of the same issues facing the United States. And it was interesting to hear that China so far hasn't had this socialized medical system, which of course we in Europe take for granted. And we thought that China also had this, but they didn't. The United States has the best healthcare in the world, I'm sure, if you can afford it, but it doesn't have this socialized healthcare where everyone can get the health care they need. So it seems like China is also battling some of the issues faced by the United States. And I don't think many people realize that.
Yes, this is very interesting. I'm specialized on these issues. One of my specialization is trying to understand the healthcare system in China. And quite a number of people who worked with me at my university were specialized in this field. And we talked to our Chinese colleagues a lot about this issue because we thought that from a European point of view, it would have been much more helpful for China and its economy if they had started investing into these social security systems at a time when they were growing quite strongly and quickly. The standard answer to our criticism was that they said, if we give the people too much security too early, then they will not be as eager to work and to earn more by working more. For that reason, we cannot afford to give them this security. It is the lack of security that makes people work as hard as they do in China. And this is very true. I mean, people work a lot. I mean, they laugh at us when they hear how many days off we have a year. People in China wouldn't have any vacation during the year. Now they have, like Japan has also not a lot of holidays for their workforce, but they have like these 2 weeks at least during the year where everybody is on vacation. China has copied this system. The United States economy is running much better than the European economy because they don't have to deduct so much money from the income of every individual so that they can run their social security system. And at the same time, the government doesn't have to spend as much money as European governments do in order to uphold this system, despite demographic problems, right? And so they said, why should we run into the same problems Europe has? If we look at the US, we think that the situation in the US is much better. At this particular moment, many people in China discuss Darwinism, this idea that only the strongest can survive. This idea was introduced to China at the end of the 19th century, and it is very interesting to see that it still has an enormous influence on the minds of people. And they think if you're sick and you don't have the money, then you die. And if you're sick and you have the money, then you survive. So what? That's life, right? And so they think if you have this Darwinist system, it makes people go. I want to be rich in order for me, in case that I'm sick, to be able to get the best treatment ever. Can you imagine? I mean, this is no motivation for anyone in Europe, I would say. But for China, this is very interesting. And we did a lot of research among very poor people and asked them how they cope with this system. And they would usually, in interviews, tell us, you know what? If we are old and sick, we sit on a chair and wait to die. That's it. We would never ask our family to spend too much money on us because we know we are old. We are a burden for them. So if we're sick, we wait for our death to come. It's very interesting for a government to be so unsocialist and not to be met with the criticism of everybody in that country who is supposed to believe in socialism. This is because they have a very traditional attitude towards the idea of being sick, which says, okay, sick is sick, and if you die, you die, and if you survive, you survive. This is, of course, only true for old people. The healthcare system in Europe is a system in which every individual spends more than 30% of its lifelong spendings on healthcare during the last months of his or her life. Can you imagine? These people in China say, okay, I'm sick. Okay, I wait for my death to come. Of course, this is very true for the poor people. People who are in more affluent families, I think that the younger generation would not dare to expect for the older generation not to ask for the best treatment ever. No matter how old they are, they would still do this. For the lower strata of Chinese society, and we talked a lot to peasants, to I think minorities about this issue, and they all gave us the same answer.
Very interesting. I wouldn't have expected this answer from you. Thank you. That's really some great insights, maybe a bit shocking for us to hear, but I think in the United States, so many people don't have health care either. And one could argue that the great socialized health care, which exists in Europe and also in Canada, especially in Europe, I can think of many instances where people maybe are not motivated to work as much as they can because they feel, well, the state will take care of me. And in many instances, the state does take care of you. For instance, in Austria, they're really trying to change this to make more incentives for people to actually go out and contribute to GDP as opposed to sitting at home and receiving some subsidies from the state, because we have such an incredibly successful welfare system, which moving forward might not be able to be financed because of the demography also of societies in Europe, which are shrinking. In China, we have income gaps. So you have all these billionaires, which we hear about in the West, where we think, okay, China is a communist society. But now when I hear you speaking, it sounds much more like a capitalist society, like the survival of the fittest. You know, this is very much how Americans would think. If you're good, if you're strong, you deserve to make a lot of money. And it seems like China also would agree to this, and that you have these many millionaires, if not billionaires now in China. And on the other side, you have a very large rural poor class, and then you have these very rich people who, of course, can afford the best healthcare system, the best everything that money can buy.
Well, I think this gap between rich and poor is also one of the characteristics of middle-income countries. To a certain degree, in a country like China, we must understand that people who have power are also the people who are very rich. And people who are very rich want to have political power, and people who have a lot of political power want to be rich. And in this situation, this gap between rich and poor is very, very dangerous for the stability of the political system. And at the same time, it is very prominent. I mean, it's not just that you see that there is an enormous difference between, for example, first-tier cities like Shanghai and Beijing and Canton, and second-tier or third-tier cities. These are not only smaller cities, but also cities that are not as rich. For example, a second-tier city is, by its per capita income, not as rich as a first-tier city. And when you go from the big cities into the countryside to a second-tier, third-tier cities and into the villages, you will see that there is an enormous difference. And this is one of the reasons why when I talk to people about China, I very often say China is the world, because China includes the first world, the second world, the third world, and the fourth world. And this is, of course, also one of the big problems that central government is confronted with. It's like governing the world. Nobody can govern the world at large because there are so enormous differences between the different parts of the country. I always say, in comparison to what our politicians have to do to run the country, a Chinese politician, no matter whether the politician works at the central level or the provincial level or even at the county level, the kind of challenges they have to meet are enormous. And quite interestingly, they're also investing a lot into developing the abilities of their politicians to run the country, which then also includes that they have to give a lot of incentive to people to, to choose the profession of the politician to participate in running the country. And this is one of the reasons why power and money is very closely linked to each other. And this, of course, is a very tricky situation because it's very easy for populism to arise in China because this enormous gap between those up there, the elites, that not only have power, but also a lot of money. And my situation down here at the bottom of society is so enormous that if somebody came, like Mao Zedong did before 1949, and organizes the dissatisfaction of this enormous um, population and the enormous number of people who are potentially dissatisfied, then you can easily see that things can change in China from the inside rather than from the outside. This is one of the reasons why, of course, the party always has to mitigate this problem and see that they somehow accommodate the wishes not only of these really rich people, but also of the poor people. And for example, Xi Jinping's campaign against corruption, I think is really interesting because this campaign against corruption is very often taken in the West as targeting one of the main issues of Chinese society, which is corruption. Corruption is a big issue in Chinese society. But I tell you, I mean, he is not actually targeting this issue. He is targeting two issues simultaneously. The one issue is, as everybody is corrupt in China, I can always pick someone who is not loyal to me, tell everybody that this guy is corrupt, and send him to prison, and he is out of my way, right? On the other hand, I can show these people down there that if you grow as rich as these oligarchs, then the party leader comes and penalizes these people and tells them, you're not supposed to be that rich. And for that reason, he tries to accommodate the dissatisfaction of the people with lower incomes by showing them that it is a high risk in China to be rich. Because if you're rich, you might be a target of his corruption campaign. To a certain respect, he tries to calm down the anger of these people in the lower strata of Chinese society by telling them how risky it is to become rich in China. And he can do this without ameliorating their standard of living in a way that would be real. Very interesting strategy.
Seems like a somewhat populist strategy when you think about the people watching the guillotine and them knitting, getting rid of the top layers of society, having their heads chopped off. That picture comes to mind here. Many experts are now saying that China has become a destabilizing force in the global economy, with President Xi pushing for his export-driven economy. And this policy is not just bad for whole industries around the world, it's also distorting China's economy and alienating trade partners. Chinese competition is costing Germany about 10,000 manufacturing jobs a month and could strip Indonesia of hundreds of thousands of garment worker jobs. China's trade surplus ballooned to a record, now we have to think of this number, 1.2 trillion last year. As a share of the global economy, China's surplus in manufactured goods is the largest amassed by any country ever. China now accounts for roughly 30% of global industrial production, and by 2030, it is expected to reach 45%, according to a 2024 UN report. With the exception of the United States economy immediately after World War II, there is no historical precedent for such a concentration of industrial power. Measured as a share of global GDP, China's current manufactured good surplus is greater than the combined surpluses of Germany and Japan at any point in the 1980s. So, Is China a destabilizing force for the global economy? Is the next world economic crisis made in China? Is the world's ability to absorb Chinese overcapacity at a breaking point?
Very difficult question. And you can imagine, that there is lots and lots of discussion around the world, and that especially people who are very critical of China participate in this discussion in order to think of a future without communist China. So there are people who think that China's economy is structurally in such a problem that it will collapse sooner or later. And the moment the Chinese economy collapses, then the world economy will come into even greater problems than it is in at this particular moment. But if the Chinese economy collapses and the world economy will immediately run into enormous difficulties, we have this one advantage, which is we can get rid of the Communist Party of China because China's economic collapse will make it impossible for the Communist Party of China to continue its rule over China. So there is this one group of people who have this set of arguments. And I think if you look at Donald Trump's trade war, if you look at his tariff war, he very much agreed to those people who say we cannot defeat China militarily, but we can defeat China economically by bringing this economy into such enormous difficulties that the dissatisfaction of the population can no longer be calmed down, and they will eventually take to overthrowing the communist regime. So this is one set of arguments. The second set of arguments is the argument that many economists in China bring about. And they say that China is in a process of transformation. It started out as a developing country and then developed into a so-called emerging economy. During that period, it heavily relied on its export capacity in order to accumulate wealth and in order to step by step climb up the ladder of technology, so that it started with very low-end products, very cheap low-end products, and it then step by step moved up the ladder to now produce products of very high value, which of course generate more income. This is all export driven. And the Chinese economy is now at the point where it produces too much to be exported, as you just said. But at the same time, it has a difficulty to develop internal consumption as a very important second pillar of its economic development. Chinese economists always have an idea about basic laws of development taking over the country without human beings being in a situation where they can change this too much. Objectively, every country that starts out as a development country then develops into an emergent economy. Once it goes beyond this emerging economy status, it will have transformed itself from an export-oriented country to a country that is supported with its economy by internal consumption. And China has been trying to go through this transformation, and Xi Jinping has very actively supported and propagated the idea of China being a country that is supported by its internal consumption for many years, but it simply does not take this step. And the reason is what we just said, because the social security system is so deficient, but people want to have security. There are now, many of them are now affluent enough to imagine that they don't want to be poor again. And for that reason, they save their money in banking accounts, but at the same time, in the past, the banks used the fact that China had such a very high saving rate for their loans that they gave out for investors to make the Chinese economy grow. And now they are stuck with all the money in the banks, but They don't have enough investors that want to use this money to invest it into the Chinese economy. So the second explanation for what is going on in China at this particular moment is an explanation that says this is only a question of time. So we are running through a transformation and we will eventually achieve our transformation to a point that we are an economy that doesn't bother other economies so much as we are bothering at this moment, because we will have more internal consumption. And last but not least, the third explanation that is given at this moment looks at this development from a historical and comparative point of view. And there are two countries that they need as comparisons of the US and Japan. Between World War I and World War II, the US was an economy that was building up its capacity by export. In this situation, other countries had an enormous problem with the US because the US was exporting so much. And these countries at the same time also had received loans from the US during World War I. So it was a very difficult situation for the European countries because they had to buy so many goods from the US, and at the same time they had to pay back their loans to the US. So it was an incredibly difficult situation for Europe. As a matter of fact, we had this problem with the balance deficit the way we have it at this moment with China, but at the time we had it with the US. And it's only after World War II that the US was gradually changing its economy, not only into an economy that was very much pushed by internal consumption, but also into an economy that was heavily dependent on other countries giving loans to the US, and the US buying more and more of the goods that they needed for their internal consumption outside the US. Right. So this is interesting to see that the US also started with an export-oriented economy and then suddenly changed itself into an import-oriented economy that, of course, was still very dominant because it was the most innovative economy, and it was an economy that could preserve its dominance over the Western world by the dominance of the dollar. Right? And so this is something we have to have at the back of our mind in order to understand why Chinese economists insist that their economy has to move on from an export-oriented economy to an economy that is focused on internal consumption, because they copy in their minds the historical development of the US. So why do we need Japan as a comparison for China? Because there are people who say the US killed the dynamics of the Japanese economy because they saw that Japan was moving up the ladder and reached the point where Japan, a comparatively small country, was the second largest world economy. This already started being clearer and clearer to the US during the 1980s and 1990s. They started taking all kinds of measures against Japan, threatening to replace the US by being the most dominant world economy. They started taking these measures in the middle of the 1980s. And we know that Japan has been in a terrible situation with regard to its capacity for economic growth since its real estate bubble burst. And we can say that since 1995, Japan is in a stagnant situation. And for all of us who follow the situation closely, we know that the Japanese economy is now running into major difficulties, also because the relationship between the yen and the dollar is very bad for Japan. And it's also bad for the US, by the way. So with other words, there are people who say China is not in a situation of transformation, but China is in a situation where the US identified that China is now so strong that it might overcome this gap between China and the US and overtake the US as the most dominant and the wealthiest global economy. And for that reason, the US now has to take all kinds of measures to make this impossible for China. And as they know that they were successful in killing the dynamic potential of the Japanese economy, they're now using more or less the same measures to do the same thing with China. And that's the reason why the Chinese economy is in enormous difficulties. And by the way, if this explanation of the situation is right, this would also imply that, much in contrast to Japan, that has been surviving this stagnant situation with the people in Japan keeping calm and not going against their government and against their political system. The Chinese situation is still shaped by the idea of the population changing the situation if the situation becomes unbearable. And for that reason, if the third explanation is correct, this would imply that the US not only takes measures for the Chinese economy not to overtake the US economy, but it at the same time takes measures to bring the Chinese economy in such enormous difficulties that eventually people will take to the streets and try to overthrow the rule of the Communist Party in China.
So one of these measures might have been the U.S. Just recently, in an unprecedented move, intervened to subsidize the yen. And it did this by selling euros and without informing the European Central Bank. And the Europeans were totally unaware of this, according to the Financial Times. This was the first time the U.S. has acted in this way towards its European allies, and these are allies, let us not forget that. Although the yen has already lost some of its surge, it shows that the sudden yen strength alters regional trade dynamics with China, impacting economic competitiveness and currency flows across Asia. The strong yen also diminishes China's relative cost advantage in manufacturing and eases pressure on neighboring Asian economies struggling with weak currency fallout. Beijing views Japan as a primary strategic competitor, as you just mentioned, and mobilizer of resistance in the South China Sea, which we also discussed in one of our podcasts. Despite Tokyo having no territorial claims there, China accuses Japan of acting as a non-regional proxy for the United States, utilizing lawfare, diplomatic pressure, and military cooperation with nations like the Philippines to counter Chinese maritime ambitions. So what does this move by the U.S. mean for Europe, for Japan, and for China? Has the U.S. now made clear that when it comes down to it, Japan is the more important ally than the Europeans?
I must say that I think that this transaction is so complicated that even the most advanced experts have some difficulty in understanding what is going on here. It's very interesting. I tried to read into this issue and I found out that some articles don't even mention that they used euros to buy out the yen rather than US dollars. Some articles don't even mention this fact. I don't know why, but I think this is quite disturbing. I mean, the whole complexity of the whole process is such that we need to understand why the US uses euro to buy out the yen. So some people say when Donald Trump was first asked, what the hell are you spending US dollars on helping Japan? He and his Secretary of Treasury said, oh, this is because Japan is such a wonderful and close ally. And if they give us a call and say, we have to help them out a little bit, of course, we'll immediately help them out. So you knew immediately that this was not the right answer. And it was very interesting that both Trump and Besant gave exactly the same answer. When they were asked, what the hell are you doing? They both started with tearing running down their cheeks and saying, oh, poor Japanese friends have this terrible problem. And of course, we help our friends, right? Everybody knew that this was not the fact. So some people say they did this because Otherwise, the US would have run into enormous problems because the Japanese government would have had to sell all of or many of their US bonds in order for them to be able to support their own currency. And if they had sold so many of US bonds, then this would have an enormous effect on the situation in the US, which, according to my understanding, is a country that has built up an economic situation since the end of the Second World War, which is based on debt. Right? And without debt, the US economy cannot run. But if your debt gets too expensive, or if you can no longer convince other countries of the world that they need to buy these US bonds, then they have a problem because they live on debts. And if other countries don't support them living on debts, then the US economy will run into enormous problems. So some people say this is the main reason why they actually took this measure. And from my point of view, reducing the complexity to this point, that you only look at the yen-US dollar relationship, helps me to understand at least a little bit, right? Whereas there are only very few people who think about this situation that you just described, that they are helping Japan, but weakening Europe at the same time. From my point of view, and I'm a specialist of international relations rather than of international finance, I can understand the situation in the following way. Look at a triangle, which is headed by the US. The US is the main player in this triangle. And here you have Europe, and here you have Japan. So you see that both Japan and Europe are a little bit hesitant to assess the situation, to which degree the US is still an ally they can build on. Both have problems. Japan doesn't really know what would the US do in case China starts a war in the South China Sea or with Taiwan or something. And Europe doesn't really know what would the US do if Russia loses its temper and starts attacking NATO countries. Can we count on the US supporting us? So the US knows that both actors in this triangle are hesitant about the US's attitude. Okay. So in this situation, what can you do to make sure that they still regard the US as the main actor? You align with one of the two in order to make the other unhappy. So what does Mr. Trump have in his mind? Europe doesn't support us in our attempt to claim dominance over the Strait of Hormuz. So they need to be punished, right? But Sanai Takaichi, the Prime Minister of Japan, has already told the US that they're very much willing to support them, that they're sending their vessels and everything. And also they are taking over quite a lot of the burden of presence in the South China Sea so that you can deter China from attacking the Philippines. So in this situation, you declare Japan to be your best friend. And by declaring Japan to be your best friend, you at the same time tell the Europeans, if you want to be supported by us, you have to be as nice as Japan. And so from the perspective of international relations, I think the Trump administration always tries to catch two flies with one stroke. And this implies that by using euro in order to support the yen, they could at the same time help Japan and penalize Europe. And this is, I think, one of the ways how they develop their strategies. They have done this several times. I think we can also see this in the context of supporting Israel in going to war against Iran. So at the back of their mind, they had, if we do this and if we are successful, then this will be a heavy blow against China. So for that reason, we can do this, although we don't necessarily need to go to war against Iran.
If you step back and look at that picture, it makes total sense. But of course, now we have a new threat on the horizon, namely the so-called economic D-Day coming our way. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNBC that Washington will impose, and I quote, toughest sanctions in history to, quote, collapse the Iranian government, calling on other nations, including China, to join the effort. China has criticized the U.S.'s president's economic D-Day push against Iran, warning that additional sanctions will fail to resolve the ongoing disputes and war. In a Truth Social post, Trump said that, quote, this will be economic warfare and isolation on an unprecedented level, end of quote. And no one has given the Islamic Republic of Iran a greater opportunity to make a deal than me, says Trump. And that, quote, tragically for them, they have failed to take it. The president named oil smuggling, currency swap lines, cash transfers, exchange houses, ship registries, and front companies as channels he wants to shut down for Iran immediately, stressing that Iran will never be permitted to acquire nuclear weapons. So my question to you is, how will China react to economic D-Day, and how will this affect China and China's economy?
Well, first of all, one must know that China has accumulated such an enormous amount of oil and gas that China is now one of the reasons why our prices for oil and gas have not gone through the roof the way many people anticipated in earlier phases of this war. So, of course, China has a very good instrument in reacting to this economic D-Day and supporting Iran to a certain extent, at least, because they can consume their oil reserves internally or make it impossible for the world economy to profit from the fact that China is not importing so much oil at this moment. So China could wait for a situation before the midterm elections, change its policies, and suddenly start buying a lot of oil and gas on the world market. And then this will make prices go through the roof. This is the easiest way China could react to this situation. But I think that Donald Trump has again underestimated the possibilities of Iran reacting to this situation, because Iran still has enough missiles to ruin the economy of the Gulf countries. And by ruining the economy of the Gulf countries, Iran will ruin the world economy. If they ruin these countries, this implies that even when the war will be over sometime in the future, it will take a very long time for these Gulf countries to rebuild their infrastructure in order to serve the global demand for their products. I think he is absolutely underestimating this possibility, that Iran, in a situation where the country is confronted with this kind of threat, they say, okay, things can get no worse. So why should we restrain ourselves and not hit the countries in our neighborhood as badly as we can hit them? And I don't know why they don't take this into calculation. From my point of view, this would be a natural reaction, especially as people say Iran has learned to live under these enormous sanctions for so many years that the country can go on living under sanctions for more years to come. I'm a little bit dubious about this explanation, because we do know that China helped Iran to circumvent many of these enormous sanctions that the US and Europe put on the country. And I think if, for example, China would no longer be able to support Iran the way it has supported Iran in the past, then maybe people would also come under very severe difficulties in Iran and maybe not be able to live with these sanctions as they lived with the sanctions in the past. But from my point of view, this economic D-Day shows some desperation on the side of the US, because obviously all the hopes that Iran could be defeated by military means, and all the hopes that Iran could be defeated by decapitation, and all the hopes that Iran could be defeated by having the population of Iran go against their own government, all these hopes have not come true. And so now it seems like the last instrument they think they can use against Iran is this economic D-Day. But desperation is not good for a rational assessment and analysis of a situation. And I think and I hope that there are people in the US that somehow have access to Trump and his administration and explain to them what means Iran still has to react to this thing. And if Iran takes to these means, this will be devastating for the Gulf countries and for the world economy at large.
So we should all be worried just about now. And it was in the news also that Iran and Oman either had already reached a deal or were shortly before reaching a deal regarding the management of the Strait of Hormuz, which we might add was open and free of charge before the US and Israel started their war. Let's just remember that. Let me return now to our original topic, namely if the next economic meltdown will be made in China. And there was a pivotal moment, which you already mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, that I wanted to come back to, namely when China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. It was pivotal for China and for Beijing, which used the WTO rules to grow its economy while critics argue that it bypassed free trade market goals through heavy state subsidies, which of course still exists, forced technology transfers, and a lack of financial transparency. The World Trade Organization is a global trade rule-setting institution. It has 166 members, and all decisions are made unanimously. It promotes free trade by requiring all members to adhere to certain principles, emphasizing low and predictable trade barriers. While Western nations initially backed China's entry with the hope that economic integration would drive political liberalization and a transition to a Western-style economy, that outcome obviously did not materialize. Instead, China successfully leveraged its WTO membership to transform into an economic superpower while maintaining heavy state control over its economy. So, has China swallowed the WTO and put the US and other Western nations at a disadvantage? Was letting China into the WTO a mistake by the West?
Well, I think the first thing we have to understand is that China would never have become a member of the WTO without US consent. The US is the most dominant country in WTO. So if everybody agrees, but the US does not agree, no way for a country to become a member of WTO. And we must also remember that during the 1990s, China had a very long series of deliberations with other WTO members, especially with the US and with Europe. And Europe, as well as the US, were confronting China with a great number of demands of how to change their internal settings so that the country could conform with WTO rules. And at the time, the people who were in power in China complied with most of these demands and opened the Chinese market to a degree that was unprecedented, right? And so we must understand that it was not only China pushing that it wanted to be a member of the WTO, it was also the US and Europe pushing China into the organization in order to make investment in China more stable on a robust legal basis so that risks for investment in China would be lowered. And this is something that people totally forget. They always see China in the driver's seat. China was not in the driver's seat in the 1990s. China was not in the driver's seat immediately after becoming a member of the WTO. It only has become more dominant in this situation comparatively recently. Right? And we must also understand that for a country like the US, that had already started deindustrializing itself much earlier than China entering the WTO. It is no problem for China producing so and so many goods for the US because, as I just said, the US is a country that dominates the world economy because it is a country that gets loans from all over the world, or put it that way, all over the world needs to buy US dollars because they export so much in the US for them to be respent, right? So this is a very tricky situation. So the US invented China as a new creditor to the US. By having China export so many goods to the US, its central bank was full of US dollars. And what can it do with these US dollars? On the one hand side, it can buy high-end products in the US. But the most important thing is China started buying lots and lots and lots of treasuries in the US, bonds in the US, and was thus financing, for example, the war in Iraq. It was financing military presence of the US in Afghanistan, because without China investing into these bonds and treasuries, the US would not have had enough money to sustain all these international activities, to put it mildly, right? So for a very long period of time, the US economy was heavily benefiting from China being a member of the WTO. And the same is also true for Europe, although the situation in Europe was different. Europe was exporting quite a lot of things to China that China could not produce itself. And at the same time, China was producing very cheap products that could be exported to Europe. But as Europe was exporting high-end, very expensive products to China, and China was exporting to Europe things that were very cheap, there was no problem with the balance between Europe and China. And of course, China already in 2015 published a document, Made in China 2025. And it told us what it is going to do for its economy, not to be this low-end economy, but moving up the value chain and eventually coming to a point where China exports its high-end products to Europe, rather than Europe exporting its high-end products to China. Now suddenly the situation changes. Europe exports all kinds of meat and milk and butter to China. China exports e-vehicles and all kinds of high-end products to Europe. And in this situation, it's very clear that the balance will turn around. It is enormously interesting to see how China deindustrializes Europe, and Europe actively participated in its own process of deindustrialization, because Europe saw the US being deindustrialized and having a very strong economy. So why should Europe be afraid of being deindustrialized? Now suddenly we realize, oh my gosh, there are so many things we don't have if we don't import them from China. But years ago, everybody said, oh, this is a wonderful deal because we don't need to produce at a comparatively high price things that we can buy much cheaper in China. And so you can see that the situation now has changed, because China is not only becoming stronger in terms of economy, but it is also becoming stronger in terms of its military capacity. And it has much more influence among the global South countries than it had at the time it entered the WTO. Now China is a challenger, is a competitor. And in this situation, we suddenly realize, oh my gosh, China is forcing us to import so many things. I mean, historically, same process that the US underwent starting from the end of World War I until today. And this is the playbook that China is playing. So if you want
But
to
of course,
know
China,
what's the next step China is taking, look into the history of the US and its development to the most prominent economic and military power around the world. And you'll see most of it, especially in the realm of economy, very much conforms with the US development.
but maybe it will try to avoid all the pitfalls that the US has taken. Of course, when the US supported its move, China's move to become a member, I guess it was hoping that if China would become more of a Western-style economy, that this would also destabilize it politically, which didn't happen. And of course, China took advantage of the WTO rules about being a developing nation and kept insisting it was a developing nation, even though we all knew that it no longer had this developing nation status, because under the WTO rules, it gets all these special advantages if it is a developing nation, as opposed to being a first world economy.
I think we have to be fair in this assessment, because if
Yes.
you look at the per capita income in China, by per capita income, China is not a developed economy according to Western standards. We have to keep this in mind. I always say China is not a developing country like we have developing countries all over the global south. But at the same time, we must also realize that China is not a developed country according to first world standards.
But it did take advantage of those rules.
Yes, of course, because, when China entered the WTO, I was in China very often at the time. China was a developing country, and they didn't give the status of developing country to them as a present. Now that China is insisting and using all kinds of leverages in order to make it impossible to change its status in the WTO. This is true. And I think that the situation today is very different from the situation in the year 2001, and this should be acknowledged by China. But at the same time, we cannot say that China should be treated the same way as the US treated. And I tell you one thing, when the US thought that China would be a good partner in WTO, most people in the US, and I think many people in Europe, thought that with the development of the Chinese economy, China would also change its political system. So why is this so important? It's not only because we want everybody to live in a democratic country, and that's why China needs to be a democratic country. No, it is because they knew from the Japan experience, if you make a country your ally, and this implies that this country also has a political system that is very similar to your political system, then the US can drive this country into accepting certain economic measures, despite the fact that they are against the interest of this country. Japan was allied with the US, and it knew that without obeying to the rules set by the US could easily retreat from its security promises to Japan. The US calculated if China develops economically, then modernization theory tells you the middle class will become stronger and stronger. Once the middle class will become stronger and stronger, it will ask for participation. The Communist Party will not give them participation, and this is the moment where you can go for regime change. Once the regime will be changed to a democratic system in China, we can then say, we supported your regime change. That is why you have to comply with the rules we set for you. And what rules do we set for you? These are the rules that make it impossible for China to move up the ladder and overtake the US in its economic capacity. But according to what the US had planned for China, at least so far, it has not worked out. And now the US is confronted with a competitor that is not dependent on the US. Europe is dependent on the US. Europe is number 3, right? And despite the fact that Europe is dependent with regard to its security on the US is pushing very heavily for Europe not to become stronger economically than it is at the moment. Japan is an ally of the US, but the moment it becomes economically so strong that it threatens the leading position of the US takes measures, and Japan has to comply, right? And now we have China, a country that does not need to comply. The most important signal in this direction is China's reaction to the tariff war. Everybody said, oh yes, we will somewhat bargain with the US to get the tariffs a little bit lower. And China said no. And by saying no, China showed that it is not dependent on the US. And for that reason, it is now an independent competitor, which makes things totally different.
Yeah, I guess the US wasn't counting on the development it took also when it took China into the WTO back then. It's created a very large and serious competitor, and it might overtake the US sometime in the future. So experts and economists are now saying we are in the midst of a China shock 2.0, which is centered around China's unfair economic practices and illegal subsidizing of specific sectors, and also the devaluation of the renminbi. As the EU is losing market share because of China's production substitution, meaning China is using domestic substitution, which it calls guachai, which replaces foreign-made industrial inputs, components, and technologies with Chinese-made products. Would you agree that we are in the midst of this China shock 2.0, and what does that mean for the West? How should the West react? And would you agree with the title of this podcast, saying that the next economic meltdown will be made in China, or do you see it coming from somewhere else? Maybe the United States, for instance.
Well, I must say that I'm hesitant to see China being so strong that it can force the world into meltdown, because according to my understanding of ongoing discussions in the People's Republic of China, they are more afraid of an economic meltdown that will hit their export-oriented economy than they would induce an economic meltdown by themselves. And this is one way how I react to this situation. The second is that I'm not so sure that the Chinese economy is in a situation there where it can afford to take measures that are detrimental to the economic development both in Europe and in the US, because China's export economy still heavily relies on the exports it makes to the US and Europe. The profits it can accumulate by exporting to these two markets are uncomparable to all the exports it can make to the global south. And we also have to understand that the comparative costs of exporting to the global south are much higher than exporting to the US and Europe. So I think that China doesn't want the economy to melt down, but I am much more afraid of a future perspective that puts China in a situation where it can no longer prevent the world economy from melting down because of its own economic problems and because of the fact that the economy has the problem at its very head, which is the US economy. So these two things simultaneously. Look at the 2008 year. The financial crisis. In this situation, Krugman said there is only one country in the world that can help us to get out of this crisis within a comparatively short period of time. And this country is China. And China did make an enormous effort, both to overcome collaterals from these crises for its own economy as well as for the world economy. We see the US dollar has a problem. We see the yen has a problem. We see the situation in Switzerland being very unusual with the franc. We see that Europeans are not in very good shape either. In this situation, China might be no longer strong enough to help us out of a crisis, right? A crisis that is accumulating day by day, by day, by day. Europe is running into an enormous debt crisis because of the support for Ukraine. The longer this war goes on, the more Europe is going to run into a debt crisis, and it will be very difficult for Europe to get out of this debt crisis again. I see the world economy running into this debt crisis, and China is itself also a country with enormous debt problems inside. So there is this entanglement between the Chinese economy on the one side and the economy of the global West on the other side. The global West can no longer rely on China helping out if the global West economy runs into an even deeper crisis than it is in at this moment. And the fact that now Donald Trump, tries to push the yen by making the euro look very ugly, does not help this situation very much, because it makes the global economy even more difficult than it already is. And on the other hand side, if he also wants to hit China, it makes China's ability to maybe come to our rescue even smaller. Mao Zedong once said, never hit at the 4 different regions simultaneously, because you will lose. What is Mr. Trump doing? He is hitting at the 4 regions, which is a Chinese saying for the whole world, simultaneously. I don't think that this is a very good idea. And I tend to think that there is a higher probability for the US tearing us all into a deep world economic crisis than for China to be the initiator of a world economic crisis. But at the same time, I see China growingly unable to rescue a world that is heading towards a world economic crisis.
And the US debt has achieved unprecedented levels also because of its war on Iran.
Yeah.
So it's growing at such an unprecedented level that it's becoming even more than scary at the moment.
Yeah, it's very, very scary. And at the same time, we see that the way the US economy is organized, there is no limit to their creating more and more debt. This is one of the things that economists from Eastern Europe identified as one of the reasons why the economies in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union finally came into such a crisis that they could no longer sustain. You have this soft limits for your indebtedness. You go on and on and on and on and on. And as long as the world buys US treasuries and bonds, they can go on and on and on, thereby allowing the US to live on debt for the future to come. And of course, there is a strict limitation to this, because the moment the US can no longer repay its debt, then of course we are in the middle of shit.
So maybe the better title would have been, is the next economic meltdown coming from China or made in China, or will the US crash us? For what we were
see
just
that
discussing
we cannot
now.
answer the question without looking at the US, and that there is an enormously strong relationship between those two economies, of course also the economies of Europe, and that when you look at the situation in the US, you ask yourself, in whose interest is what they are doing at the moment? Even though it might be against the interest of everybody else in the world. But can the US economy sustain if everybody else is running into a crisis?
And can the US put everyone into such economic misery just to achieve its goals? I mean, this would be a good title maybe for our next discussion, because we might be just headed down that lane with economic D-Day approaching.
I think that for the US, this is not a valid question. I don't think that they have a moral approach to this question, saying, how can we do something that brings the whole world into difficulty? If they can argue and show that what they are doing is good for the US economy, I don't think that there is any limit, any moral limit.
Well, I don't think this war in Iran has been good for the US economy, because if you look at the price of gas, it's at unprecedented levels. So at some point, something has to give. And I hope that peace or some end to the hostilities will be the answer.
Yeah.
Suzanne, this has been an incredibly interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you. I'm exhausted because you asked me difficult questions that are somewhat outside my sphere of expertise. But as you might have noticed, I try to keep up with those things, although they are sometimes very difficult to understand, especially if you're not a diehard expert in this field. But on the other hand, I think it is interesting and important for us to try to understand. Because if you say, oh, this is so difficult, nobody can understand it, let them do what they want, then we don't have any control, analytical control over the situation. We are totally depowered by having to accept what's going on, and we can't even catch up by trying to understand. So I thought that was a really exhausting session, but it was very challenging and interesting for me because you forced me into using all my intellectual capacities into understanding a very complicated world. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And remember to like, follow, subscribe, and tune into our future discussions. Bye bye.
Bye.